The author Barbara Kingsolver once said, "It's the one job where the better you are, the more surely you won't be needed in the long run." Welcome to the Mummafesto, the podcast where politics and parenting mix together. I'm Stella Creasy, I'm a backbench Labour MP and mum to two young children. My guest this week is the writer, activist and co-founder of the Women's Equality Party, Catherine Mayer. Catherine began her career as a journalist working for The Economist and Time magazine before founding the Women's Equality Party in 2015. She's campaigned to end violence against women, to tackle MPs accused of sexual harassment in Parliament, and has also been the president of the Foreign Press Association. Welcome to the Mummafesto, Catherine. Catherine, welcome to the Mummafesto. I'm so pleased that you're with us today because you have been such a powerful advocate for women in many different ways, but also particularly on this concept of motherhood and what it means to be or not to be a mother. Why don't we start with you just talk a little bit about your personal decision making and how you come to be here today.
And I'm pleased to be here as well. I'm really glad you're doing this podcast because it is the most important subject in so many ways. I don't know about you, but I get asked this question all the time as a feminist, as an activist. What's the one thing that could change everything and, bring about equality? And of course, the real answer is there isn't one thing. Everything is interconnected.
Is it not arming the women? Let's just arm them.
Naomi Alderman had a point with the power, obviously. But I mean, in terms of my own decision making, I never wanted children. It's one of those things where I understand why I made that decision. My mother was somebody who had to give up quite a lot and who unintentionally transmitted that sense of the things she might have done if she hadn't had small children. She was a product of exactly the age that Betty Friedan writes about in The Feminine Mystique. She even went to the university that Betty Friedan studied for that book, where there were all these women getting wonderful educations in order to make better wives and homemakers. And of course, they were all massively frustrated. And my mother didn't even graduate. She dropped out early in order to go and have children. So although I have a very close relationship with my mother, I don't think that it's a coincidence that we're a very unfruitful family. I have two sisters, also, ended up with stepsisters as well. But my two biological sisters, only one of us has a child between the three of us. And I would add to that also that my mother had a lot of tragedy in her early life. So she lost her own brother and her father when she was very young, and then ended up the only grandfather I ever knew killed himself, her stepfather. And so I think, Betty Friedan called it the problem with no name, the problem of women who wanted to do so much more and couldn't. And I think my mother also had a terror that had no name, which was one of loss. And so those two things transmitted quite strongly. So I think that's why I always grew up thinking I really liked other people's children. I still do. But I didn't ever think that I wanted them myself, and I was never convinced I would have made a good mother. And being a good mother was, to me, you don't have children for your own satisfaction. You have children to parent them well. And I didn't know that I would.
That's an incredibly personal admission to make, an incredibly powerful thing to talk about, because the decision whether or not you have children is an intensely personal one, and I believe an intensely private one. It's nobody else's business what you choose to or not to do. But you've written very powerfully in the sort of intervening years about grief. Obviously, you lost your husband, and in fact, your mother lost your father, her husband as well. Sorry. And that at that point, again, revisiting that decision and reflecting on it. Just tell us a bit about that through the years as well.
Well, I mean that's been a funny one because, of course, any woman um, will go through much more consciously than men. I mean, obviously there is something about what age is the ideal biological age to have children, and some men leave it too late. But for women, the sense of the biological clock is a much stronger one, and it's something that we all are aware of. So if you have decided not to have children, you're constantly checking yourself against where you are. Um, because I looked quite young when I was in my 50s, people would still be asking me if I was intending to have children. It is a question. You're absolutely right. I mean, people are massively intrusive about asking about your plans. And I used to sometimes it would depend how people behaved if I tried to sort of bat them away, because I agree with you. I think it's something you can choose to discuss, but it shouldn't be something that's extracted from you. And Andy, my husband, had testicular cancer when he was younger. So periodically, if somebody annoyed me enough, I would tell them that it was not possible for him to have children, and let them deal with their discomfort that way. Um, but
I found I struggled to have children for many years, and in the meantime, that was a deeply personal thing as well. People would always ask me, "Well, are you intending to have
yes,
children?" As though it was an easy thing to do or any of their business, and finding a reasonable, polite way of batting people off was always a really hard thing to do. I wish I'd had your excuse to be able to make people feel embarrassed that they were so intrusive.
well, I mean, to be fair, I think it was possibly a lie I was telling, but I mean, it was a lie based on truth, and it just annoyed me precisely also because I knew so many people who were struggling to have children, and it drove me mad that people thought that that was an appropriate topic of conversation, and also because of all the things that come with it. You know, employers are never supposed to ask this question, but I was asked it regularly in work situations, in inappropriate ways. And the absence of children also then became a topic of conversation, because it is assumed to be not that you've made the decision on the very human grounds that you might not be the best parent you could be, but that somehow you lack feelings. And it's something that we've seen with female politicians. I mean, I covered German politics for a long time, and of course, Angela Merkel, her lack of children when she was before she became the chancellor, it was absolutely held against her as something that she could never understand life. And then, of course,
Theresa May had it. I was absolutely incandescent for Theresa May that she was questioned about her capacity to be a prime minister, whether or not she'd been a mother or not, and that people stood against her, other women stood against her, that somehow this was a sign of your femininity and a sign of your ability to care about other people. It's a very strong trope in society, isn't it?
it absolutely is. And then, of course, when Andy died, um, people, I mean, Andy died at the start of the pandemic. It would have been hard at any time, but there was a very real isolation because he died just before lockdown. So I was then locked down on my own in this echoing place. And people thought it a good idea to ask if I now regretted not having children, um, which
Awful. I'm
I
so
think,
sorry, Catherine, that happened to you.
I mean, to be honest, I also thought it was very funny. People don't know how to deal with death at all, so it trips something in their brain, and they all say, not all of them. Some people say wonderful and sensitive things, but a lot of people just blurt out whatever it is they're thinking. And to be honest, I don't want to be too critical of it because I much preferred the people who tried to engage to the ones who ghosted you because they were scared of your ghosts, which also happened.
But you talk very powerfully in your book about both you and your mum experiencing grief together, and I think it's quite interesting what you're saying there about your mum's experience of having to bring the three of you up, you then making a different choice. This is a podcast about the influence of parenting on our politics. How did the pair of you sharing grief and those different circumstances in your life affect the outcomes?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I mean, I think because and that's why my mother's history is also very relevant because um, I think there was some way in which her past experiences sort of echoed down through the present, and she's not somebody who emotes a lot. She's very, I think that's also what happens when you've been through a lot. Um, Neither of us really are. So our way of dealing with grief was already shaped by the past in many ways, and it was also shaped by circumstances. So we both were able to compare the fact that people didn't think we were grieving properly either, because we weren't weeping enough, we weren't rending our garments, and you know, and it again that people assume an absence of emotion. But that's something about women as well. There is it's the Goldilocks syndrome, isn't it? You're either too emotional or you're not emotional enough, but you never get it just right.
Well, and the decision whether or not to have children is never one you can make in the right way either, because once you become a mum, that hinders you. Also, choosing not to be a mum hinders you too for people. But obviously, many people listening to this will also know you as one of the founders of the Women's Equality Party. And I ask about your family history and the decision that you made not to have children, to ask as a context for how do you think that influenced the advocacy and the campaigning you were doing at that point when it was clear that women could never get it right, whatever we choose to do?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think the moment you realize, I mean, I don't know about you, but I'm not a big fan of the speech in Barbie. But, but the Barbie speech is basically women can't get it right, whatever they do. The reason I'm not,
There are multiple memes and Instagram hits that are the same thing. We're all getting at the same point, which is just the collective rage.
yeah, exactly. And I think there have been many better ways in which it's expressed. But if it reached new audiences, I'm all for things that reach new audiences. Um, but at the risk of repeating it, it is absolutely true that what it is to live in the patriarchy is to live in a world in which you will never get it right. The cards are always stacked against you, and but I mean, I also, by the way, think founding the Women's Equality Party. Um, I mean, as you know, you, Stella, were part of the inspiration for it. Because
We should be clear for the any of the Labour Party whips listening to this. I didn't encourage Catherine to set up the Women's Equality Party, but I was there the night that the idea came to her. That is true.
yes, so we were both at the Women of the World Festival, the WOW Festival, in 2015, and Sandy Toksvig and I were on the founding committee of WOW, and we'd been having all these conversations about our frustration that we had reached our fairly grand old ages and the equality we thought was coming had still not arrived. And so I went to this event as part of WOW where Stella was on stage. I'm saying this to the whips, by the way. That's why I'm. Um, and you were what with Joe Swinson and I've just forgotten.
Margot James.
Oh yeah, in the days where there were good women in the Conservative Party, uh, and the three of you were having a conversation about what your parties would do for women after the election. And I, because I had been having these conversations with Sandy and with other people about frustration at the slow pace, was thinking, yes, but you're not leading your parties, and your parties
Thank
will.
God.
In retrospect, and seeing what happened to Joe Swinson, I'm not sure that what I was wishing at that particular moment would have served any of you well. But it was sort of, you know, one of the things that one sees again and again in big parties, and Labour has done an awful lot for women, but Labour will also deprioritise things that it are, named termed women's issues, where we know they're people issues, not women's issues, but whatever, at various times. And that that also organisations will be part of the culture that produces them, and therefore organisations are shot through with the same problems of misogyny and sexism, and they sometimes have good phases and they sometimes have bad phases, but it does mean something for the power structures within them. So I had also been looking at what happened in Iceland when there was a women's party, and in Northern Ireland, and had just thought, maybe there needed to be one to do this external work to prompt the big parties to do better. And so I stood up and proposed it and invited everyone to the bar, and you were one of the people who came to the bar. And then when I mentioned it to Sandy Toksvig afterwards, I rang her up, because also I put it on Facebook, and like thousands of people were signing up for this idea of a party. And she said, "But darling, that was my idea." And I said, "What?" And she said, "Oh, she was doing, I don't know if you remember, but WOW used to quite often do like a women's parliament or a closing show of some kind. And Sandy was doing it, and she wanted to do a women's parliament. And she said, I was just about to ring you up and offer you the role of foreign secretary." So we instead went for some beer and decided to do this mad thing. And of course, I don't know if you saw that we had a lovely result in the local elections. We got our first borough councillor elected in Basingstoke, unseating a long-term Tory incumbent. We got 61.6% of the vote, according to Britain Elects.
So that was this just elections just gone. So,
So we've got
9 years on. So this has been a long piece of work for you to set up a political party and to keep campaigning.
Oh yeah, I mean the whole system is entirely constructed in order to keep out small parties. There are some genuinely good reasons or good thinking behind it originally, around stability and around keeping out fascism and whatever. But as we see, it's not actually working to do the latter. But it does mean that if you're a small party, a lot of the rules and guidelines for media, for example, that are supposed to create fairness and stability tend to be very exclusionary. So it also costs an awful lot to do any politics. But so yeah, I mean we remain a very small, or should I say nimble, organisation. We have some councillors, but we were always there to try and change things by winning elections, but we never thought we would. I never sadly thought that Sandy would be Prime Minister, though people really guessed it.
Listen, if it helps, I never thought Liz Truss would be Prime Minister either. So,
yes,
all sorts of random things happen.
I hate to hear them in the same breath, but yes. Point.
And I think it's fascinating, as somebody who didn't agree with your decision, because I chose to stay within the Labour movement, I choose to fight within the Labour Party for equality. It is a really powerful conversation to have about what would different look like in our political process, but also what would different look like for women, because you are somebody who has stood up for different for women. But I've got to ask, what did your mum think when you set up your own political party? I know what my mum would have thought, but what did your mum think when you went and told her what you were doing?
Actually, it was more of a conversation with my wonderful father who died last year, and was both my parents were political active. Both my parents are American, and they were both activists for the Democrats. But my father was way more deeply enmeshed in politics, and you'll be pleased to know as a Labour supporter, and therefore we had some fairly hefty discussions about what I was doing. Both of my sisters are Labour supporters. I mean, don't worry, nothing that any Labour Party member has said to me could be more strongly phrased than anything my own family has said. But I think with my mother, it was much more to do with, I am also a legendary workaholic, so I think it's much more to do with, in her case, like how much I take on and how much time that will leave over for her.
You and I have campaigned together for many years on issues like childcare and misogyny, because we can see women are being held back, coming from families where women have experienced frustration but have also been supportive. I think is a very powerful thing as well, about setting those expectations about what it is possible to do. So I'm just interested to hear your family's reaction to you taking that leap, which is quite a bold leap to do. And what do you think has been successful for women? If people are listening to this and thinking about those choices, whether to have children, not to have children, whether to campaign, not to campaign, you've had first-hand coalface experience of those impacts. What do you think is what works?
It depends what you mean. I mean, in terms of making a difference, I think one of the reasons for political activism in general is that it's a form of optimism, but it's a form of optimism that is because if you don't do it, the alternative is the opposite of optimism. It's the notion that things can't get better.
Is it shouting?
Is it at the TV? Yes, but
it's shouting at the telly and getting cross.
Yeah, but it's worth. I mean, because we're in a particularly scary political cycle now. I think the worst I've seen in my lifetime in so many different ways, and we're actually seeing progress for women being undone. We're seeing it being attacked on all sides, and not to be active at this point would be. What would you do? Would you not shout at the telly, but put the pillows over your head and try to shut out the outside world? I don't know. But for me, that wouldn't be an option. But also, I think the other thing about activism, and it's one that you've proved in your work, is that you can make a difference. You can't maybe make the universal differences you want to make. You can't, smash the patriarchy at one go. But every victory helps, because every victory not only helps towards what you believe in creating a better world, but it also gives hope that there is a point in continuing to do the work. And I think that's why people like you, and to a lesser extent I, are also the target of trolling and abuse and whatever, is because people can see that fact about it.
Well, I wanted to ask you about that because I also wanted to ask you about the backlash. And in particular, I think very recently there started to be a backlash around the concept of motherhood and how this should be the goal for women. And it should be a particular type of motherhood as well. And we've seen some of those sorts of ideas circulating around that if I naively, honestly thought perhaps we'd put to bed. And I wondered what your take on that was, the debates about why we shouldn't have childcare because it was forcing women to be away from the home when they should want to be at home with children, and that women who choose not to have children are doing so because the world isn't supporting them financially to do it, rather than because it's a personal choice that they might make. I wonder what your take on that backlash about motherhood was.
No, that's huge. I mean, part of it, that's part of the populist playbook. The sort of right-wing populist playbook is to summon up an image of a world that never was, where it's the kind of 1950s happy housewife, which of course is what Betty Friedan was writing about all those years ago, exposing it for the myth that it was. And it's not that some women don't get full satisfaction out of choosing to be mothers, and it's not about forcing women to be mothers, or denying them that choice. It is about choice, and it is about false choices. And you know, one of the other things that happened when we founded the Women's Equality Party was people kept saying, "Well, why are you doing this? Women already have equality." And that notion that that the fact that people don't see the way that the burden of care falls absolutely disproportionately on women. Um, Periodically, they will see it. They saw it during the pandemic, for example, but then they want to forget about it again. Um, and but I mean, when I say I'm very worried about the rise of um, the far right across the world, and of course that idea of promoting motherhood is not only a particular kind of motherhood, it's by a particular set of people. And you have all these terrible conspiracy theories around the place about, the great replacement or whatever it is. And so there's this idea of motherhood as being the way of nation building, but the right kind of nation. And that goes all the way back. I don't know if you know that the French, I'm sure you do know this, that the French still give a medal for women who have 8 children or more. You can go to the Elysee Palace and get a medal for it. And
Surely you just get a divorce, don't you?
by the way, you have to be married to get the medal. So things are intensely socially conservative, but they're also linked through to an idea of the right kind of child. And so, I mean, opposition to birth control, opposition to reproductive rights of any kind is very often linked to the idea that women need to reproduce, but as I say, the right women, so white middle class women, are the ones who should be reproducing in order to build the nation. And one of the main and early policies of the Women's Equality Party has been around providing universal free childcare, because that would be transformative. And also, it is one of, we work with the Women's Budget Group on this to show that it would actually be something that helped grow the economy as opposed to being seen as a cost, which so much of everything around care is always seen as a cost rather than an investment. So it's trying to sort of advocate around that.
Well, I
Um,
also thought it was quite powerful in your book. You talked about the people saying, well, you've not had children, who's going to look after you? Because, of course, there is also a presumption that women will care for older relatives as well as younger relatives still, that we still have within our society. So that care penalty never ever stops.
no, well, and because we are likely to live longer and on less money, we can't throw money at the problem either in the same way that men can. To be honest, that wasn't just people saying it to me, that was me saying it to myself, is, suddenly being a widow, I'm 63 years old, I suddenly am very much on my own, and I had to think like, oh God, what is going to happen? Um, and I have got absolutely no answer for that. But, I didn't want to. That's what I meant about the reasons why one would have children. People were talking about it to me as if this was something where I should have had children in order to have domestic servants. And
Like,
no, I don't think it works like that.
no, I've been trying to train my kids to go and get me a drink from the fridge, but at 2 and 4, they just keep drinking it for themselves or spilling. It's just not working. Um, but I think
Well,
it does speak to the fundamental paradox, and it's a paradox this podcast in a way is trying to explore, in that the decisions to become parent or not become parent, parenting in itself can be so influential on your life choices and what happens to you, but at the same point, true equality is that that shouldn't be taken into consideration, because I've yet to meet a man who's had as many people say to him, when are you going to have kids? Are you going to have kids? Who's going to look after you? what you're going to do if you don't have children. We don't ask those same questions, and it's such a powerful demarcation point, the idea of a biological clock,
Well,
and that somehow that's something you should be listening to all the time.
well, there's something else I experienced as a woman in the workplace, much more than men in the workplace. So for years, I was a news journalist, which meant that I was working very inhospitable hours and very much at the mercy of breaking news cycles. But there would also be a scramble around the official holiday periods, and people like me, i.e., women without children, would find that it didn't matter how senior we got. Somehow we were the ones who were expected to cover Christmas and Thanksgiving, because I was working for Time magazine and whatever. And again, there was not that expectation on single childless men, because somehow there's a different idea of how they spend their spare time. I'm not quite sure what it is, but
I blame Richard E. Curtis films for that, and the Love Actually, and the different ideas about men were going away writing books, women were sitting in an attic pining.
Yes, well, I mean, if I've got two books on the go at the moment, and that scene in whichever is it Love Actually, the one where the pages blow into the lake and they dive in and have a romantic encounter in the lake. That's about as far from the reality of book writing.
But I have to ask you, Catherine, because this podcast is called the Mummafesto. It is about what do you want to see on the agenda in the coming up to the general election that would address these challenges, these barriers, these ways in which women are held back because of these outdated ideas of motherhood. So if there was one thing I would force you, of all the things that you're working, all the things you're campaigning on, what would you want to see on the agenda?
Well, it's 100% universal free childcare, and it would be from the end of paid parental leave at 9 months. So 40 hours a week available for 48 weeks a year. And if, as I say, it's something that we've worked on with the women's budget group, and it's been costed, and we have all the figures, and we have where we would get the money from, and so it's something that Rachel Reeves, because by the way, I as I said, we're not expecting to win a general election. That's not, we might get round to winning a seat or two at some point, but that's not why we're here. We're here to make politics better generally. And so, I want to see a change of government. I want to see a Labour-led government. And I mean, one of the things, by the way, I want to admit in this discussion about having children and not having children is I don't think that my feminism has been tested in the same way that yours has, because I have been a relatively high earning woman while my husband was alive in a double income household without dependents. And it meant that Andy and I never tested our relationship that way. I mean, I'm happy to say I had a lovely nearly 30-year marriage, but, it's one of those things where I know so many people where the stresses are all around the caregiving. But I also know that in terms of working life, in terms of the negotiations, I have swerved it. So although I don't regret not having children, I sort of feel like that's the one area of my feminism that never got fully tested. I hope that all the people that I worked with in the various organisations where I was an employer felt that I sort of made up for it by understanding their situations well, because that was something that was terribly important to me. But
Well, that's an incredibly powerful admission to make, and a really, I think a lot of people listening to this will be really reflecting on that and the impact. I have to admit that I did go and see Barbie, and my partner and I both went to see Barbie, but mostly because we have small children, so that we could fall asleep in the cinema somewhere in relative safety, knowing that our daughter would be transfixed by the pink. But thank you so much, Catherine, for being part of the Mummafesto today and for sharing your story. And I might not be a member of the Women's Equality Party anytime soon, but I do recognise and respect the work that you're doing and appreciate the fact that you are trying to champion things, causes that we all care about. So thank you.
Thank you.
I hope you've enjoyed today's Mummafesto podcast with Catherine Mayer and her really powerful story about her personal decision not to become a parent, but also the impact of parenting on her political choices. She and I might be in different political parties, but I really admire her openness and courage on this issue, and I hope you've enjoyed listening to her today. And I hope you'll enjoy listening to the next set of Mummafesto podcasts, so please tune in now.